Question.
At the start, you said, oh, this was about working out what we might want to do. Is there anything we can do, or is this just about information? Regardless of what we may or may not feel about it, is there anything we can practically do, or is it just about keeping being informed?
That's a very good question, isn't it? And
I think I'd take encouragement from the land registry example in that whilst we often approach these things feeling that we're probably powerless in the face of sort of government wishing to do what it wants to do, that a public campaign and concerted pressure there did put a stop, at least for the time being, to the GovCo model being implemented in land registry. The dilemma we've got at the moment, and genuinely this is a dilemma, is that it is very difficult, based on the limited information we have at the moment, to determine exactly what our stance toward GovCo should be. If we accept for a moment, and I'll sort of share Clive's sort of cynicism around, you know, the extent to which we should trust our elders and betters entirely and always, if we take
which I do.
Of course, you know,
in case there's any
yes, that's taken as read. If we assume for a moment that Ordnance Surveyor being entirely upfront and saying, look, the reason why we're not making a great big sort of public hoo-ha about this is that we just want to achieve some very minor changes that allow us to get out from some of these burdens whilst retaining the greater bulk of everything we've got at the moment, and we want to do it quickly and quietly because the more fuss is made about it and the more scrutiny and the wider the exploration of options, exactly as appeared to happen in land registry, where a helpful minister at the 11th hour said, OK, GovCo, but hang on a second, what about joint venture or maybe outright privatisation as well? But that's, I think, really what put the mockers on that. And there is a risk that if we push to have a wider public consultation and automatically go into campaigning mode to seek to oppose this, that we very much might end up with something worse. Because another meddling minister somewhere might say, well, we don't want you to remain largely the same, but with just these tiny little extra flexibilities. We might like the idea of you being privatised. The Treasury would like a big chunk of money, thank you very much. So we've got to be really careful about the timing and how we choose to approach this. And it's fair to say, we just don't know enough at the moment to, with a clear conscience, say, this is what our view should be. So I think there are things we can do, but at the moment, we're wanting to be informed and guided to a large degree by what your thoughts and concerns are, so that we can ask such further questions as enable us to answer that question as to what should our stance on this be. You know, should we be outside and pasting the Daily Echo with headlines and starting early day motions and petitions in government, or should we take at face value what the OS leadership team are telling us and say, OK, quickly and quietly does it, and then we get something that is not as disadvantageous as it might be?
Are those our only two options?
Not necessarily. I mean, as Neil said, you know, there's a broader thrust around looking at a variety of options at the moment. However, we still can't see whether we would be better off being a mutual. And I think the experience with mutuals, like any form of what is effectively a staff buyout, is some of them are more mutual than others in terms of who can benefit and to what extent. The risk of joint venture or privatisation, I would say, is sufficient that we need to be mindful of it. I don't think it's a straightforward choice of we fight to stay as we are or we agree to move to GovCo. But we could have, at an appropriate point in time, ask the question of saying, well, we want to see exactly why mutual has been discarded, why trading fund and staying exactly as we are has been discarded, and what assurances we have against privatisation, or indeed, for the sake of completeness, what are the advantages of privatisation and why aren't we doing that instead? People will have that view to some extent.
I might just, before we let Jonathan have a word, I might just add to that. I mean, it's certainly not too late to do anything yet, because the case has been submitted through BIS. BIS has supported it and is now circulating it in a mysterious way around parts of government to get clearance, and that process is somewhat opaque. But the fact that it hasn't come back quickly suggests that not everybody has said, this is a brilliant idea, let's do it. So if we wanted to interfere, then there's probably time, yeah.
But there are risks with that.
But there are risks,
It's by no means an automatic choice of we should fight this until we're persuaded it's good, because raising the profile of it may very well land us somewhere that's conceivably far worse.
But the chance of that this side of the election is actually, I would have said, small. Given what's happened with Royal Mail privatisation, I'm told the Environment Agency, Land Registry, is Vince up for another fight with, hopefully, the public, customers, etc.
I suspect...
Privatisation, I've been here 40 years, privatisation has been there for 40 years. It's, you know, this doesn't make it go away. The quinquennial review, if I'm right, actually said this is a necessary first step to privatisation.
That's a concern. Yeah, I think that the reason why...
But privatisation might actually be good.
Well, it might be.
But
like all things,
given I'm due to retire, it's not a big concern.
The devil's in the detail, and it depends on how you do it, of course. You know, and like with all of this, you know, in a sense, frustratingly, Ian Nunn is absolutely correct to say what the status, what the nature of the public task, to what extent are we ring-fenced against privatisation. All of these things depend on what is written into the Articles of Association of what the company is set up to do. They could all be put
Can I just add something there? The public task isn't the issue around who owns a database itself. Is there a...
Oh, I've got, yes, I could say a word about that. Yeah,
Thank you, because that's always been a sticking point, who actually owns that and whose is it to give away to whoever. And is that a
That is an interesting point, because,
yeah.
again, looking at the papers from QQR,
yeah.
the assumption was that the Crown, or the controller of Her Majesty's Stationery Office, would have to assign the copyright in the data that we currently hold to Ordnance Survey, the company. It would therefore cease to be Crown copyright, and any further work that we did would be our own copyright, so the company would have it. And one of the considerations was that that would be a one-way street, in effect. You couldn't get it back into Crown copyright once you'd given it away. The question was asked of John O'Mara the other day on Monday about that, and his view seemed to be rather different, that actually we would have a process of probably licensing, so that the company would license Crown copyright material, the stuff we hold now, and we'd have something written into the rules that would actually assign any new copyright to the Crown. So in effect that the copyright would remain with the Crown. Which is sort of interesting, because that makes it, of course, the thing more of an operating company, but not actually owning its major asset.
Right.
So there's obviously lots of variations on that too.
So is there any mileage in traction in that, in your questions? Or
Well,
you feel you're getting, there's nothing there, is there, for us?
I mean, at the moment, the difficulty with the answer to all these things is mainly, well, we don't know because we haven't written up the Articles of Association, of course.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of work has been done, but we're not being shown work in progress, which is perhaps an issue in itself.
Although we anticipate and will be given a clear steer, I guess, in terms of how our attitude towards this should be, that once the decision in principle is taken and agreed, and that stage one green light there is no real reason we can see as to why OS can't then be much more forthcoming about what they can share with us. I can understand at the moment that they just about get away with saying, well, you know, this is all potential, it's not actual, it's not definite. Once a decision's there and it's for them then to say, yeah, we'll do it, all permissions are in place, we would expect them to release sufficient additional information to us so that we can properly look at the details, and we have a further meeting set up with them specifically to look at all of the issues that surround terms and conditions of employment, so we can get a better handle on exactly what a move under a given set of Articles of Association would mean for staff. Because I think that's the biggest question at the moment, as well as to what it would mean for individuals. There are probably advantages to Ordnance Survey, much as Ian Nunn describes, around the ease with which and speed with which they can do business if they free themselves from certain protocols. None of that in and of itself, though, necessarily translates to any benefits to staff, unless you subscribe to this view of kind of trickle-down economics that a brilliantly successful ordnance survey will somehow enrich all of you eventually. But again, that all depends on what's in the detail. Doesn't necessarily follow. They have said in the FAQs that have gone up today, perhaps a bit more usefully, in answer to the question around would GovCo free us out from underneath the Treasury pay freeze regime, whilst I don't have a definite answer to that, it is something they are certainly seeking and are looking to put into this framework agreement with MAGIX the ability to effectively manage their own decisions on pay through the GovCo board rather than it being subject to Treasury. Now, that's hopeful, but it's also quite cleverly worded in that it doesn't answer the question, particularly if you take the question as having two parts, because there's the civil service pay remit run through Treasury which applies to civil servants, which yes, you would definitely be free of if you no longer are civil servants, but there is also the broader public sector pay policy, which coincidentally also imposes a 1% cap on pay to be paid to public servants. So it all depends on the status of you under the GovCo employment model as to whether or not you are still somehow classed as public servants because you work for a government-owned company. If it follows that you are, then one would assume the 1% pay cap applies just in a different format. You know, that you then get clobbered with this policy rather than that policy. If we get to a point, however, that says, yes, we're genuinely free of public sector pay constraints and it is genuinely a board decision to look at remuneration, then there is something potentially quite attractive in that, because on the assumption that Ordnance Survey continues to be a profitable organisation, and there's certainly no reason to suspect it wouldn't for the foreseeable future, it does at least put us back in a position of having much better collective bargaining power when dealing with one single employer here, to seek to, I suppose, extract a fair share of the value of the company back to the individuals who generated that without having those constraints. It doesn't mean everyone will automatically get pay rises, but it does mean that that's not automatically ruled out by dint of government policy we can do very little about.
In areas where Ordnance Survey management have got flexibility, have you noticed that they're using that to the in a way that you would want them to use it as our negotiator?
No, I still feel, I mean, you know, if I'm playing devil's advocate and saying, this sounds brilliant, where can I buy some? That it also sounds exactly like the snake oil that was sold in terms of becoming a trading fund. You know, there's a familiarity to these flexibilities that if you read back through the 2002 quinquennial review and the issues around trading fund, you would not be wrong to think, well, can't we do nearly all of that now anyway? Wasn't that the point? In fairness, I suppose, they get away to a degree by being able to say, yes, we thought so too, but it hasn't happened that way, hence this. That's maybe quite a lot to take on trust to say, okay, we'll try the new version.
I mean, it does, you do have to wonder about the wording, don't you? Because even if you read the wording of the trading fund rules, I mean, it basically pays delegated to the Director General and Chief Executive and has nothing to do with government, except that government insists on you know, in effect, the threat, I suppose, to the board is, well, you'll follow these rules, and if not, you know, look to your job.
And this is another point that causes us a genuine sort of dilemma, because given the pay restraint regime you're currently subject to, and the likelihood that that is going to continue for the foreseeable future, and that's regardless of whether there's a change of government next time around, because when Rachel Reeves, she then I think the Shadow Secretary to the Treasury, came and spoke to the Civil Service Sector Executive Conference at Prospect, whilst she was speaking all manner of wonderful things about what Labour would do for the lower pay, when we specifically asked the question about what she was going to do to aid apply to professional civil servants subject to 1% pay cap, the answer was effectively, we have no plans to change that. Now, it's fair to say that the economy has improved somewhat since then, so, and we don't have sight of what will yet be in manifestos, But I think it's a fairly safe bet to assume that even if there's a Labour landslide in 2015, which would seem unlikely, that doesn't mean that there'll be an end to the pay cap regime. And I think that takes us back to this point of saying it's by no means an automatic choice to say GovCo bad, staying as we are good, because staying as we are isn't very good actually. You know, as we're about to experience from the pay round we're in, which will be yet another 1% implemented, continuation of the dispute position, because as yet there isn't sufficient momentum across the civil service sector at large to be able to overturn the government on this policy. So there is something that is superficially at least, and probably materially attractive about saying, if we get somewhere that allows us genuine negotiations based on the success of the organisation on its balance sheet and weighed up against our collective bargaining power, from a negotiator's point of view, I'd very much like that in some ways, because we could have some genuine negotiation. And that hasn't happened here since about 2006.
Can we bring Jonathan in for his question
I was
before he
gonna say,
retires?
we better let John ask a question before he retires.
Basically, I view this as the opening of Pandora's box. And I look back on certain industries and businesses that, in one of your earlier slides, you mentioned about opening the door to people from applying for jobs from overseas, from other parts of the world. Americans, I think, were mentioned in the phrase. And a certain company called Cadbury's being taken over by Kraft Industry, and then the workforce in Cadbury's being dramatically shrunk in strength. And looking at the way this is going forward in a very, very quick process without letting the world know, makes me think that the same process could be applied to this organisation.
It could, yeah. It's a significant risk. I suppose if I was being absolutely devil's advocate, I'd say that the takeover of Cadbury's by Kraft was subject to very public consultation and public awareness, and that seemed to count for absolutely nothing at the point where they reneged on all of the so-called cast iron promises that had been made not to do exactly what they then went and did. And as Connor said, you know, this doesn't go away. So it's a question of saying, do we go down fighting the best fight and possibly win, and if we win, have we won anything worth having? Or do we take a view of sort of pragmatic, guarded, sceptical engagement with a view to saying, okay, convince me, show me where the advantages are, give me the assurances to the degree that they can be made as tight as these things ever can be, and rather than sort of jumping blindfold off the cliff, do we take something more of a cautious step of faith? Don't know. Don't know. It's genuinely too early to tell. But I think our position must mainly be guided by what your views are. You know, we have our views amongst the branch council, which are guarded scepticism, but not yet of a position to say we should outright oppose this, because that might not be in people's best interests.
I think we've got to keep an open mind about it, and but not to be rushed. Not to be rushed into such a quick decision, because it affects everybody.
Well, we haven't got control over that decision, have we? That's what we're saying. We honestly think we've got control over the decision that's going to be made.
Control, not influence, yes.
No.
Has the branch council taken a view on the questions that you posed earlier in terms of, we talked an awful lot about the bottom of what's in it for us. And I think the impression I get is it's anybody's guess. What about the other questions you posed? Have the branch council formed a view on that? Well, I hope you have. Is it one that you're prepared to share with us?
I think we were hoping that, because again our branch council discussions thus far have been one of saying, right, we need to find out what we can so that we can digest that, look at the details, pull it apart in the way we normally do and come to a view. So into our first formal consultation meeting we went with our 6 questions, and the first 5 of which were really answered by the non-answer of, well, it's just a chat at the board, and we said, someone look into this. Now, as I say, it is my hope that once the decision in principle is reached, that we have much better scope to say, right, we want to see all of those things now. Risk register has been mentioned, for example, in the intranet FAQs today, so we will be asking a follow-up question to say, okay, out of all the non-paperwork that doesn't exist in reference to this project, can you show us the non-existent risk register, which you said exists to monitor the risks and concerns about going down this route? Because at least we know there's something there now, and it's a reasonable assumption that we'll get to see that, and from that to get some wider questions.
I think it's fair to say that one of the risks identified is trade union opposition. So it's still open to us.
There was a question for the gentleman back there. Yes.
And then Elaine.
Sorry. It seems a bit of a recurrent theme over the last half an hour is the lack of rationale, or certainly compelling rationale for why we're doing what we're doing. So what can we do, or what can the union do to extract or get at some of that more compelling rationale? And you mentioned, and as an example, you referenced that there was a case going to bids and beyond. What visibility, for example, is there of that case?
That's precisely the question, actually, I think we need to ask, because yeah, you sort of feel that if we're looking at this case as it's presented to us and thinking, well, I'm not, I get the idea, but I'm not sure I'm 100% persuaded that it's not enough to make a major decision. Surely there must be more somewhere that's being presented to government, so it would make sense for us to have sight, I think, of whatever case has been presented to government on this, because otherwise it does, as you say, sound a bit thin. I mean, there's more and more coming out, and there's an FAQ out today which addresses just that, well, tries to address just that point, which is, I'll just read it out actually. I keep seeing and hearing this sentence, which allows the GovCo to operate on a commercial basis in a way which cannot otherwise be achieved. Can you please provide detailed examples of the stuff we have not been allowed to do as a result of our current status? Which I think is the question that we all keep coming back to. And again, it says, well, there's freedom from procurement policies, but again, that's about flexibility so much as what we can do, and perhaps the speed of it. Partnerships, joint ventures and acquisitions, well again, we have done them, but they're slower, they're cumbersome as they are now, but they can be done. And it finishes up basically just by saying this is all going to be much easier, but there doesn't seem to be that sort of killer argument about the one thing that we really want to do but we cannot do under the current arrangements.
I'm not sure we'll ever get to a point where we will feel genuinely satisfied or convinced that this is necessary. And I wonder on the back of that whether those are the questions we should in fact be asking. Because it's probably fair to say that the sort of slightly glib OS view that, well, this is just a better way of us being able to do what we do now, may be as sort of correct as it isn't, perhaps. I think in terms of what we can do, the most useful thing, given that I'm a large fan of self-interest in motivating people to do things for the greater good, is to keep on asking the questions about wanting to be convinced as to why this is advantageous to me. What is in this for me as a member of staff that benefits me in any way that I don't currently have? Because it's clear to see that depending on the value you place on them, it varies, but there are definitely things you lose out on as a consequence of no longer being civil servants. You lose that greater flexibility around redeployment options, you lose some of the greater protections around length of process, periods of reflection around restructurings and the like. That's not to say that what might come back the other way isn't a fair trade-off. And I think the best way we're able to position getting potentially the best deal out of this, if it's going to go ahead for members, is to make sure there's sufficient pressure, not just from the usual suspects of the branch exec, but from the staff at large saying, I'm sceptical, I want you to convince me. And I want you to convince me in terms I can understand that mean material advantages compared to where I am now. You know, what's in it for me is a perfectly fair and valid question. It doesn't make you in the least bit mercenary. But asking that and making sure that all the levels of management throughout the organisation are fully aware that the staff are engaged and interested with a view to saying, well, if I'm not convinced, I might find myself in a position of looking to oppose this. That comes back to the question of whether or not there's anything we can do about it. And I think actually there is, if we can galvanise and focus such influence as can be brought to bear. It's not without risks, as I say. You know, there are concerns that if we go down the route of writing letters to MPs, asking questions so they can ask questions about why is this being done, why is it being done now, why can't we stay as we are, and seeking to have that much more forensic public examination of the merits and demerits of the case, that really does open up Pandora's box, because I think it does pull back onto the table joint venture, mutual, stay as we are, privatisation, and have the decision potentially wrested away from the control of here and made elsewhere for the benefit of elsewhere. That said, it doesn't mean I trust what's being said to us at the moment. Yes, Elaine, and then over here.
I was very surprised actually that there is not going to be a public consultation, considering that we are, if you like, a national treasure. And I think once this kind of gets out into the public domain, there will be a lot of members of the public who will be surprised that they haven't been given the opportunity to make some sort of comment. Is there any value to us sort of pressing those buttons for public consultation and getting, because the public will be equally concerned about the impact of privatisation and what's in it for the public in terms of our change of status?
Yes, there is. The difficulty, and it comes back to this broader question of what should our stance be as the larger trade union here, is around timing. It's not whether or not that's a good thing to do, it's when is it the right thing to do. And I think at the moment it's not clear that that is the right thing to do, because it does bring into play, or if we assume, as I say, that OS are genuinely in good faith saying we just want to make the smallest changes required to give us the flexibilities to do this. We don't want ministerial sort of pokings around into why we aren't also going further and doing this, because the Treasury would love, particularly following the sort of botch around land registry, to say, well, if that's 20-something billion pounds we're not getting, let's get it here instead.
20 billion, that's what you think we were?
I think that was the estimation around land registry. I think they thought the land registry.
Any estimation around us would be anything like that.
No, but there will certainly be an appetite amongst the more hawkish elements, and maybe a review to saying, well, why not now? We might be booted out of power in a few months' time. Get through what you can when you can. So the timing issue is genuinely really difficult. This is by no means clear cut for us. And I think that's
not push it until after, but as a consultation, not push it until after the general election.
Not necessarily.
Not the way consultations are done these days, which is often rather short and sharp. But,
what is your view, and is there a relationship with management's stance following in an aspirations exercise current staff, ensuring staff leave the business, I think we've got quite a few, and or putting in a pool for possibility of relocations and other jobs? Is there a relationship with this? And out of interest, how many people have left as a result of this? How many people are in the pool as well? Because I'm quite convinced that a lot of members of staff aren't aware of this is going on.
I think and other branch councillors are probably better in touch with these issues than I am, because I've not been directly involved to any material degree. The aspirations processes have been certainly something of a departure from the way in which normal restructurings might be done. There does seem to have been far too much emphasis on the speed, and the way in which the processes have been constructed gives significant cause for concern, not least because what's being ring-fenced as potentially suitable alternative employment and what hasn't doesn't seem to follow much logical sense in many cases. Whether that is linked to any positioning to become a GovCo, I don't know. Is the short answer. I don't think this is all being done in preparation solely for a change of status. I think it is more to do with, you can argue about whether that's the link, with new individuals coming in those departments and saying, these are the sort of shape and size teams I want and the roles. And I don't think it's necessarily directly linked to GovCo. We have made the point back through the branch that although OS has sought to say these are not really collective redundancies because the numbers involved fall below the collective redundancy threshold, that we're of the view that actually they do fall into collective redundancies, because by the time you take the few there and the few there and the few over here, over the overall reference period, I think it's clear that there are more than 20 people certainly at risk of leaving the business. How many actually go on to do so remains to be seen.
You just said potentially at risk to leave, but there's already quite a few that we already have. So are you aware of the number? You just said 20.
The number of people at risk of redundancy, I would say, is in excess of 20. The number of people who've already left, I don't have a direct answer to. Some people, even though they have had the option of going into the redeployment pool, have for their own reasons said, I'm not interested, I'll just take the money. Those have been sort of individual decisions.
It strikes me that there are, I mean, as departments, we all rely on each other to work coherently to get things done. And yet you see that you'll turn up somewhere and ask something of somebody and find that the whole setup's been restructured or changed around and the person's not there. And this is the sort of thing that's not being communicated. It's that sort of thing that why you don't actually get the message out there, no one knows. And it doesn't up that sort of sense of, well, what is going on?
I think this is what you can call, what euphemistically called a year of transition.
But it will all be back when we GovCo.
Well, you see, yeah, and I think I suspect the way to look at this really is that there is a lot of upheaval going on, of which the GovCo is just part. So it's not so much that things are being done with the GovCo in mind, so much as the GovCo is part of the bigger picture of transforming the organisation into something a bit more agile and lean, lively, adventurous, incisive, damn it, restless, and true. True is a tricky one, isn't it? But what you might say is that, that this is not, at the moment, being handled, I mean, that whole transitional process is not being handled in the sort of traditional, conventional way in which you set out a strategy, you debate the strategy, latch onto it, and then explain to everybody what you're doing. It's much more ad hoc, much more in response to what people feel on a particular day. And you can regard that as agile or a mess, depending on your point of view.
Yeah. The trouble is, though, you've got people on the board making long-term decisions who themselves from short-term contracts. And I think,
not civil service.
Not civil service. So, I mean, they've already made that transition themselves. Like, they brought the short-term view. They want that. This is not ticking the box exercise, so people can say, well, I came to Ordnance Survey, I transitioned it from an ailing civil service who's wonderful, you GovCo, tick on the CV, I'll see you later. That would be a risk. I would see we should flag it as a risk, because these restructurings and all the things that are happening, I think it's a very short-term view. And while some of us have been in others, there are other people that come into the civil service to Ordnance Survey. They don't come for a long-term, a lifetime career, but want to see more than 2 or 3 years out of it. And my question is going to be, let's assume that we actually become a GovCo, what it's going to look like a year into it. What can happen a year into the GovCo if we can't change or influence a decision? What do you think is going to happen a year on the other side of 2016, for example?
This sort of bears on the general point about TUPE. Now, I'm no TUPE expert, so Ben can correct me, but my general understanding about it is that nothing can change in terms of our terms and conditions and so on as a consequence of the change of ownership, or in this case, status. But of course, that second part of the statement is quite important, because what typically happens certainly in commercial organisations is that just after a change of ownership, there is suddenly a commercial imperative to do half the stuff. And it's very difficult to argue with at that point, because you could say we'd have had to do it anyway. Well, hard to say. So, on the one hand, TUPE does provide quite good protection, at least at the point where you transfer. But in other respects, you might say, well, as we're already finding out, things related to change can happen pretty quickly under any status. I mean, some of these things, maybe they're being done now because they'd be more awkward after a change of status, because we'd be able to argue the change of status that was causing it.
The issue of the biggest concern there is less around whether your existing terms and conditions or the nature of the organisation are prone to sudden change post a move to legislative protections are pretty robust. What tends to happen in practice, and the greater concern, is the incremental effect of the ring-fenced staff with their terms and conditions gradually eroding away through retirement, through going off to do other things, what have you, and the income of new staff on different terms and conditions, such that the balance of priorities shifts. Now, I don't know how many of you are aware of what happened in Kinetic, where Prospect was effectively de-recognised by a fairly bullish CEO there, supposedly on the grounds that he felt that he was perfectly all in favour of staff consultation and engagement, but that, to be honest, the Prospect cadre weren't representative of the staff at large, and so it was much fairer to everyone to say, I won't just deal solely with these people, everyone can come and join in, we'll have employee reps, and everyone's view is as valid as everyone else's. Which for all the non-members, and for all the people who perhaps were members of the union, but saw that the priority of the union were more towards protecting the terms and conditions of the old guard, rather than at the same time seeking to do the best they possibly could by all the new staff as well, made that a fairly easy argument for him to win. Because although in large part the Prospect branch were up in arms about how this genuinely wasn't the case and that collective bargaining must be preserved at all costs, he had a point. You know, although it's a very bitter pill for us to have to swallow, because on harsh analysis, it's probably fair to say that the priorities of the branch council and of the bulk of the union membership had been more based around a what we have we hold mentality, and we're not for changing. If you want any change, cut it out of the new terms and conditions rather than out of ours, such that new staff weren't really particularly minded to join in. They might, on sort of singleton basis, have joined the union by dint of individual protection, should they require it, but there wasn't really any sense of a genuine collective for them to feel part of, because it made it quite clear that there was an us and them between the new and the old staff. So the challenge for us, in the event this happens, will be around not only seeking to engage properly with all of the staff that are currently here that are not members, but to make sure that as that balance shifts between to-be protected staff and new staff coming in, that we're seen to be pushing for collective bargaining and strong terms and conditions and decent pension provision and the like, and redundancy terms for all the new staff, because otherwise all we're slowly doing is knitting a noose for our own neck. And it will fit.
It's 2 o'clock.
I don't know if this is more of a comment maybe, and it's a bit of an anecdotal one, I'm afraid, but related to the TP thing. I was talking to someone who knew someone who worked for the government department that had gone through this sort of go process, and your terms and conditions were, kept saying until you got promoted, you applied for a new job, and then they said, well, you're in a new post now. And some people actually ended up financially worse off because they were contributing more to the pension.
I mean, I think in response to that whole issue more broadly, that the way we do that, the devil will be in the detail. We will get better protections and better assurances if it's clear that we can mount sufficient influence to ensure that's the case. It would be an easy question for me to put to you to say, on the issue of GovCo, for example, do you believe that this is something Prospect should campaign against? But before I would ask you that question, you would have to be clear in your own minds that a campaign is not something that can solely be carried by me or the union centrally in London or the handful of your reps that make up the branch council. Because if you want to mount a successful campaign, such as was done in Land Registry, it's you that are going to have to do it. We can put it together, we can provide the materials, the resources, the advice as to who should be lobbied, but it's you that have to do the legwork. So there's no point at all in saying, yes, you should oppose this on my behalf, because we won't succeed. If you come to a view, once further information is there, that this is something we should challenge and campaign against, then let's do that. If we do that, I think we can be successful. But, be under no illusion, that's no small effort.
And so as not to leave this, this meeting too open-ended, as people have started to drift off to other meetings now. But obviously, we haven't given all the answers and we haven't got all the questions yet either. But the next step we're proposing to take is to send out a quick questionnaire electronically to members, which would only ask a few questions about what you think and what you believe matters. And the value of that is two things. One is that it will give us a clue as to where we do go next and what the strength of feeling is. The other, of course, is something we can actually take to management and say, look, you've got 2/3 of the people who are really worried about this, regardless of your assurances. So we'll know where to focus our effort better.
So please fill it in and tell your colleagues to fill it in. And if they're not yet union members, tell them to join and then fill it in.
Yes.
And then we'll have some structured feedback that's decent ammunition.
Tell all your non-member colleagues how great this meeting was, but don't tell them what you learned. Okay, thank you all very much.
Thank you, folks.